How to Save Your Soul from Mediocrity is the subtitle of the book. You wanted to, you mentioned at the beginning the idea that Christians today have an attachment to mediocre forms of culture. And there are parts of the book where you try to explain reasons why that might be. But maybe we should first kind of make the case that this actually is true, that we have a problem with Christians being sort of attached to or satisfied with mediocrity in spheres outside of the immediately theological and moral, let's say.
Right. Well, in the book, mediocrity, so far as cultural artifacts is concerned, is generally defined as things that are very, very popular for a very short period of time. The mediocre is that which is very sensual, easy to like, easy to acquire, and which only lasts for a very short period of time. Then we're done with it. Then we need to move on to something that is also very pleasurable, also very accessible, that we will tire with just as quickly. Mm-hmm. And there's a glut of such things in the world. They're highly lucrative. Mediocre things make a lot of money. And so the world is constantly churning them out. It's easy to acquire these things. It's pleasant to acquire these things. And they're everywhere. So this omnipresent repository of cultural pleasure that's omnipresent, that we're surrounded by, requires, if we're not going to be, if we're going to do anything other than that, if we're going to spend our time on anything other than this omnipresent source of cultural pleasure, then we're going to have to be working upstream. We're going to have to go against the tide. And that's difficult, and it can be very embarrassing. And I think that that's why people are generally loath to stand up to what, on a cultural level, is just very popular and very pleasant.
Right. And if parents, let's say you've got parents who are, kind of run ragged with doing their jobs, raising their kids, just trying to keep their kids out of, mortal sin, let's say, and, right. Trying to keep them away from obscene media and things that are directly going to corrupt their souls. It may seem like a luxury good to be able to sort of not only get themselves, but their children more cultured, shall we say, or to sort of not just concede the free time, the recreation time to consistently to kind of shallow entertainments. So what would be if somebody doesn't already have a strong desire to break out of that? I mean, what can be said to kind of convince them of the importance? Because I mean, it is arguably of lesser importance than the directly moral, the directly, the directly theological matters of life.
Agreed. It's less important, but the theological and moral concerns of life are definitely related to issues of taste. And they're not forever bound. They're not joined at the hip, but there's a real relationship here. So cultural artifacts, and that's a weird sounding term, I mean like books and music and things, takes up an awful lot of our time. Whereas worship takes up a relatively small amount of our time in comparison with our lives out in the world, where we're driving around in our cars and we're listening to music, or we're putting on something to listen to while we cook dinner, or something to watch on a Friday night or a Wednesday night or a Wednesday morning for some people. So the kind of secular concerns of books and movies and things are a significant chunk of our time. It's a significant chunk of our lives. Right? We spend way more time reading novels than we do reading the Bible. We spend way more time watching movies than we do in worship. And I'm not arguing for some inversion. I'm not saying that you ought to be in a worship service 24 hours a week or 30 hours a week or something like that, because holy things are not measured in the same way that secular things are. They have a different sort of weight. Most lectionaries only prescribe somewhere around 2 minutes of Bible reading every day. Whereas if you read, Pride and Prejudice for 2 minutes a day, it'd be very annoying. So I'm not arguing if you spend more time reading novels than you spend reading the Bible every week, something's wrong. I think that's an incredibly reductionistic, almost materialistic way of looking at how people ought to spend
Right,
time.
because there's a greater density to spiritual things, kind of.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a greater density. A little bit goes a very long way. That's why the Lord's Supper is only a bite. It doesn't need to be more than that. Holy things are just not measured the way that secular things are. If you went over to somebody's house for dinner and they served you a bite of food, you'd be upset. You'd be like, that's not enough. Whereas a bite of communion is more than enough because it's a spiritual thing, and we don't measure spiritual things like we do physical things.
Right.
But so while there's a difference between the importance of cultural artifacts, books and movies and things, and worship and morality and theology and that sort of thing, I do think that they end up having this kind of reciprocal relationship. And I think that the more contented a person is with shallow books and movies and things, the more content they'll be with shallow theology. I think that the more of your time you spend on books and movies that are not worth revisiting, that you'll be embarrassed to say that you read 20 years from now, the more compromised your ability to accept and contemplate profound theological truths, I think the more that's diminished. If you're not strengthening the health of your intellect in the way that you spend your time, books and movies and things, then theology is just not going to be worth it. If you never develop an ability to love books over the course of your whole life, if you only ever really have one-night stands with books, I think you're far more likely to have a one-night stand in the real world if you never learn how to love something for a very long time. And so, yeah, it's more important that you're faithful to your spouse than that you have good taste in film, obviously. But I don't think that these things are completely unrelated.